I didn't know a single piece of paper could destroy a lifetime. But on Mother's Day, when I opened the card my daughter handed me, the words inside stopped my heart. You are a burden. No one wants you here. Your time is over. The room went silent for 3 seconds. Then my family laughed. Before you judge me, before you assume anything, pause for a moment. If you're listening to this story right now, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And if stories about real family betrayal and late life strength matter to you, subscribe, because this isn't just my story, it's a warning. My name is Marion Lewis. I am 74 years old, and that card was the worst humiliation of my entire life. 2 days before Mother's Day, my life looked peaceful from the outside. I was sitting in my small apartment in Birmingham, England, sunlight warming the curtains, a kettle whistling softly in the kitchen. I remember folding my favorite teal dress and placing it carefully on the bed, telling myself, wear this on Sunday. You always feel confident in it. I bought small gifts for my grandchildren, nothing expensive, just thoughtful. Coloring books, soft sweaters, things a grandmother chooses with love, not money. I went to bed that night smiling. I had no idea I was walking toward emotional execution. Mother's Day morning arrived bright and calm. I baked muffins the way I always did, even though my hands ached more these days. I arranged roses in a glass jar and checked my reflection twice before leaving. I wanted to look proud, useful, wanted. I kept reminding myself I am their mother. I am their grandmother. Today is my day. When I arrived at my daughter Rachel's house, my grandchildren ran toward me, shouting, "Grandma." Their small arms wrapped around my legs, and for a brief, fragile moment, I felt safe. That moment would not last. Rachel stood near the kitchen doorway, smiling in a way that felt rehearsed. Her husband Thomas barely looked up from his phone. Rachel handed me a pink card and said, "Mom, we want you to read it out loud. It's from all of us." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were childish drawings, flowers, hearts, smiling stick figures. I felt relief. I thought maybe I was wrong to worry. I cleared my throat and began reading. Roses are red, violets are. That's when my voice broke. You are a burden. No one wants you here. Your time is past. It's time for you to go. The words blurred as tears flooded my eyes. I didn't understand. I looked up, waiting for someone to stop me. No one did. Thomas laughed first. A loud, careless laugh. Rachel covered her mouth, but her shoulders shook. Even the children giggled, copying the adults without knowing why. "Relax, Mom," Rachel said. "It's just a joke." A joke. The card slipped from my fingers and hit the floor. My chest tightened so hard I thought I might collapse. In that moment, I understood something devastating. This wasn't sudden cruelty. This was built, layer by layer, year by year. That night, alone in my apartment, I sat in the same armchair where I once nursed Rachel as a baby. My phone stayed silent. No apology, no call, no message, just silence, the kind that screams. As I stared at the wall, memories began pouring in uninvited. I remembered being 29, standing in the kitchen with a note in my hand. Rachel's father had left. No goodbye, just excuses. I remembered promising myself that my daughter would never feel abandoned again. I remembered double shifts, calloused hands, selling my mother's jewelry so Rachel could go to nursing school, paying half her wedding, helping with a house deposit, babysitting for years without complaint, sending money quietly monthly so they could breathe. And now, at 74, I was being told I was a burden. But here's what they never knew. I was never helpless. I was never poor. And I was never weak. That night, I opened a small wooden box hidden in my wardrobe. Inside were documents I had protected for decades. Property papers, investment statements, proof of a life I built quietly while everyone underestimated me. Something inside me hardened. The woman they mocked that morning? She was gone. In her place stood someone who finally understood her value and what needed to be done next. I sat there for a long time after opening that wooden box, my hands resting on papers I had protected like secrets. The room was silent except for the ticking of the old wall clock. Each tick felt like a reminder of how much time I had given away and how little I had asked for in return. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rachel's face when she laughed. Not nervous laughter. Not uncomfortable laughter. Enjoyment. As if humiliating me had been entertaining. As if my pain had been a form of bonding for them. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. When did I stop being her mother and start becoming her inconvenience? The answer didn't come all at once. It arrived in pieces. I remembered a Tuesday afternoon, just a week before Mother's Day. Rachel had called me while I was washing dishes. Mom, could you watch the kids on Thursday? Thomas and I have plans. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask if I was free. It wasn't a request, it was an expectation. I went, of course. I always went. I walked 6 blocks to their house that morning, my knees aching with every step. When I arrived, Rachel was already dressed, makeup perfect, keys in her hand. They've eaten already, she said quickly. Lunch money is on the counter if you want to order something. Then she was gone. No thank you. No goodbye. I spent the whole day with Ethan and Lily feeding them, helping with homework, breaking up small arguments, wiping spills. I loved them deeply. That was the problem. Loving them made it easy for their parents to use me. When Rachel and Thomas came back that evening, the house was clean and the children were calm. Thomas glanced around and said, "Good, they didn't make too much of a mess." That was it. That was the acknowledgement. As I lay in bed now, staring at the ceiling, those moments replayed themselves with brutal clarity. They hadn't become cruel overnight. They had simply stopped seeing me as human. My mind drifted further back, years back, to when Rachel was small and it was just the two of us. I was 29 when her father walked out. I can still see the note he left on the kitchen table, folded neatly, like he was afraid of taking up too much space even while abandoning us. I can't do this anymore. That was all. Rachel cried herself to sleep that night, clutching my shirt and asking when Daddy was coming home. I held her tightly and whispered promises I wasn't sure I could keep. But I kept them anyway. I worked double shifts at the textile mill. My hands cracked and bled from constant stitching. I came home exhausted, but I still helped Rachel with homework, still cooked meals, still pretended everything was okay. I didn't want her to grow up feeling unwanted. Somewhere along the way, I forgot to protect myself. The next morning, I made tea and sat at the small dining table with my documents spread out in front of me. Bank statements, investment summaries, property deeds, numbers I hadn't looked at closely in years. That's when the realization hit me like cold water. I wasn't dependent on my family. They were dependent on me. I started calculating, slowly, carefully writing numbers down on a notepad. The down payment I had given Rachel and Thomas when they bought their house. The money for the wedding. The monthly transfers I had been sending when Thomas lost his job. The temporary help that never stopped. School computers. Car repairs. Kitchen upgrades. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking again. Over 60,000 pounds. Money I had given out of love. Money they had taken without gratitude. Money they still believed they were entitled to. And yet, they spoke about me like I was a problem to be managed. I remembered something else then, a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. 3 months earlier, I had been at their house helping with dinner when I realized I'd left my scarf in the living room. As I walked back from the hallway, I heard Thomas's voice from the patio. "She's getting older," he said quietly. "Lives alone. Depends on us too much. We're looking at options." Options. I had stood there frozen, my hand on the doorframe, my heart pounding so loud I thought he might hear it. Rachel had laughed softly and said something I couldn't quite catch. They were discussing my life like a scheduling issue. That night, I went home and cried silently, telling myself I had misunderstood. Telling myself not to be dramatic. I had been gaslighting myself for years. Now, sitting alone in my apartment, I finally allowed myself to call it what it was. They didn't love me. They tolerated me as long as I was useful. I folded the documents neatly and placed them back in the wooden box. But I didn't put the box away. I left it on the table, visible like a reminder. Something inside me shifted that morning. Not anger, something calmer, sharper, clarity. For the first time, I asked myself a dangerous question. What would happen if I stopped? Stopped giving. Stopped fixing. Stopped apologizing for existing. The thought was terrifying and liberating. I stood up, walked to the mirror, and studied my reflection. The woman looking back at me had lines on her face and silver in her hair, but her eyes were awake in a way they hadn't been for years. I whispered out loud, "I am not a burden." Saying it felt like reclaiming stolen ground. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet. I only knew one thing with absolute certainty. Mother's Day hadn't broken me. It had exposed the truth. And once you see the truth, you can never unsee it. After whispering those words to myself, "I am not a burden," I stood there for a long moment, staring at my reflection as if I were meeting myself for the first time. The woman looking back at me wasn't weak. She was tired, yes, but she was also awake. And once you wake up, you can't pretend to be asleep again. That entire week passed in strange silence. Rachel didn't call. Thomas didn't text. No one checked on me. Normally, that silence would have crushed me. I would have replayed conversations in my head, wondering what I had done wrong, planning apologies I didn't know. This time, the silence felt different. It felt like confirmation. On Wednesday morning, I woke up early and made myself breakfast slowly. I didn't rush. I didn't check my phone every 5 minutes. I let the quiet sit with me. Outside, the street was waking up, buses passing, footsteps on pavement, life moving forward whether I followed or not. I opened my laptop. For years, I had avoided logging into my online banking. It felt uncomfortable, almost guilty, as if acknowledging my own finances somehow meant I was being selfish. That morning, I logged in without hesitation. The automatic £500 transfer to Rachel's account stared back at me on the screen. Scheduled. Reliable. Invisible. Just like me. My finger hovered over the mouse. I thought of the card. I thought of the laughter. I thought of the word burden. Then I clicked cancel. No dramatic music. No thunder. Just one small confirmation message. Transfer canceled successfully. My heart raced, not with fear, but with adrenaline. It was the first boundary I had drawn in decades. Next, I opened the joint savings account we had created for emergencies. I was the only one who ever funded it. Rachel and Thomas were the only ones who ever withdrew from it. I closed the account entirely, transferring the remaining balance back into my personal savings. By the time I finished, my hands were steady. I wasn't angry. I was methodical. Later that afternoon, Rachel finally called. "Mom," she said casually, as if nothing had happened. "The school sent a message. Ethan needs a new tablet for his classes. Can you just send the money like last time?" There it was. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just expectation. "I can't," I said calmly. There was a pause on the line. A long one. "What do you mean, you can't?" she asked, her voice tightening. "I mean exactly that," I replied. "I won't be sending money anymore." Another pause. This one heavier. Rachel laughed softly, the same laugh she had used on Mother's Day. "Okay, are you feeling all right? Is this about that silly card?" "Silly. I'm feeling very clear," I said. "And no, this isn't a joke." Her tone changed instantly. "Mom, don't be dramatic. We need help right now." I almost laughed, not out of humor, but disbelief. After everything, they still believed my purpose was to fix their problems. "You'll figure it out," I said quietly. "You always do." She hung up without saying goodbye. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Over the next few days, the messages started. First, polite. Then confused. Then irritated. Thomas sent a text asking if I was okay. Another asking if I was punishing them. Rachel left a voicemail saying the kids missed me. None of them said sorry. None of them asked how I was. I stopped answering. Instead, I focused on myself, something that felt almost foreign. I walked in the park near my building, sat on benches without rushing, noticed how spring had quietly arrived without my permission. I realized how small my world had become, centered entirely around their needs. One afternoon, I received a message that finally made my chest tighten again. "Mom," Rachel wrote, "we're worried about you. Maybe it's time to think about assisted living. Somewhere safe." I stared at the screen, stunned. After everything I had given them, they were still trying to push me out of the picture, this time wrapped in fake concern. I didn't reply. Instead, I reached for the phone and called someone I hadn't spoken to in years, my financial advisor. When he answered, surprised to hear from me, I said something that even shocked myself. "I need to reorganize everything," I told him. "All of it." He hesitated. "Mrs. Lewis, are you sure? These are major decisions." "I've never been more sure of anything," I replied. As I hung up, a strange sense of calm settled over me. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was planning. That evening, I pulled out a folder I hadn't opened since my 70th birthday. Inside was the deed to a beachfront property in Nassau, Bahamas, an inheritance from my mother that I had kept secret from everyone. It had been rented out for years, quietly generating income one never touched. Rachel and Thomas thought I lived on a small pension. They had no idea. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a different life. One where I wasn't waiting by the phone. One where I wasn't proving my worth through sacrifice. One where I woke up excited instead of anxious. I booked nothing. I announced nothing. I simply began preparing. They still thought I was the same woman they had laughed at. They were wrong. For the next 2 weeks, I did something deliberate. Nothing. I didn't respond to messages. I didn't correct their assumptions. I didn't explain myself. And in that silence, they created their own story. Rachel told relatives I was confused lately. Thomas hinted to neighbors that I was forgetful. A cousin I barely spoke to called and gently asked if I needed help managing things. I thanked her politely and said I was fine. Inside, I was sharper than I had ever been. Every morning, I dressed well, not for anyone else, but for myself. I drank my tea slowly, read documents carefully, and wrote lists in a leather notebook I had bought years ago but never used. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was executing. The financial advisor met me on a Friday afternoon. He looked at me the way people do when they expect fragility. "What would you like to start with?" he asked softly. "My will," I said. He blinked. "You want to make adjustments?" "No," I replied. "I want to rewrite it completely." That finally got his attention. For years, everything had been simple. Rachel as primary beneficiary. Her children protected. A small amount set aside for charitable donations. It was what a good mother was supposed to do. That version of me no longer existed. I instructed him to place my assets into a trust. Not one they could pressure me to dissolve. Not one they could challenge easily. I chose a professional trustee. Someone neutral. Someone bound by law, not emotion. When he asked about family involvement, I shook my head. "They will not be informed," I said. We went through every property, every account, every investment, including the beachfront home in Nassau. When I mentioned it, his eyebrows rose. "You never disclosed this before," he said carefully. "I never needed to," I replied. By the time the meeting ended, my future no longer depended on anyone's approval. That night, Rachel showed up unannounced. I watched her through the peephole, arms crossed, phone in hand, impatience written all over her face. I waited a full minute before opening the door. "Mom," she said sharply, stepping inside without being invited. "We need to talk." I sat down calmly. "You're talking." She sighed dramatically. "Everyone's worried about you. You've been distant. You canceled the transfers. You're not answering calls." "I'm allowed to be quiet," I said. "That's not the point," she snapped. "You're not acting like yourself." I smiled slightly. "This is myself." She froze. For the first time, she was looking at me, not as a resource, not as background noise, but as something unfamiliar. "Mom," she said slowly, lowering her voice, "you can't just change things without telling us." "I can," I replied. And I did. Her face tightened. "What are you saying?" I'm saying, I said evenly, that my life doesn't exist to stabilize yours. She stood up abruptly. So that's it? After everything we do for you? I laughed softly. It surprised both of us. You don't do things for me, I said. You allow me to remain useful. That hit her harder than shouting ever could. She left without another word, slamming the door behind her. I didn't cry. Instead, I packed a small suitcase. Just a few dresses. My passport. Important documents. Nothing that looked like a goodbye. I booked a one-way ticket to Nassau. Not to escape. To arrive. The morning I left, I sent a single message to Rachel and Thomas. I'm taking some time for myself. I'll be unreachable for a while. That was it. No explanation. No permission. As the plane lifted into the sky, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom, quiet, unapologetic, earned. They still believed I was slipping away. They had no idea I was stepping into my power. Nassau didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a return to a version of myself I had buried for other people's comfort. The air was warm and heavy with salt when I stepped out of the airport. Sunlight touched my skin in a way England never had. I checked into the house quietly, no announcements, no visitors. The caretaker recognized me immediately and smiled with respect, not pity. That alone reminded me how starved I had been of dignity. The first week, I did very little. I woke early, walked barefoot along the beach, and let the water rinse the noise out of my head. I didn't answer calls. I didn't check social media. I let Rachel's absence grow loud on its own. And it did. By the second week, messages started piling up. At first, they were casual. Just checking on you. Let us know when you're back. Then they shifted. Mom, this is serious. People are asking questions. You can't disappear like this. Disappear. As if I hadn't been invisible for years already. One afternoon, while sitting on the terrace with iced tea sweating onto the table, I received a call from the trustee. His voice was calm, professional. They've contacted us, he said. I smiled. Already? Yes. Your daughter and her husband. They're requesting information about the trust. And? We declined. As instructed. I closed my eyes and let the breeze brush my face. For the first time since Mother's Day, I felt the balance shift. They were no longer in control of the narrative. Back in Birmingham, things began to unravel for them in ways I didn't have to orchestrate. Money stopped flowing. Small comforts vanished. Plans stalled. People who once tolerated their arrogance began asking uncomfortable questions. Rachel left me a voice note one night, her tone sharper than I'd ever heard it. Mom, this isn't funny anymore. We need access. The kids need stability. I replayed it twice. Interesting how I had never needed stability when she was younger. How no one worried about my exhaustion, my sacrifices, my silence. I didn't respond. Instead, I met with an attorney in Nassau. Not because I feared them, but because I was done underestimating how desperate entitlement could become. We discussed contingencies, guardianship attempts, emotional manipulation disguised as concern. He listened carefully and nodded. You're ahead of them, he said. That's rare. I learned late, I replied, but thoroughly. That night, I dreamed of the card again, the laughter, the humiliation. But this time, I was standing, not shrinking. I woke without tears. On the third week, I ran into someone unexpected. A woman from my past. Gloria. We had worked together decades ago, before marriage, before motherhood consumed my identity. She looked at me and laughed. Marianne, she said, holding my hands. You look alive. Alive. We talked for hours. About choices. About how easily women disappear into roles that never love them back. When I told her a small version of what had happened, she didn't gasp or offer sympathy. She said, good. Now do something with it. That sentence became my anchor. Because revenge, I realized, didn't need rage. It needed clarity. Back in England, Rachel finally crossed a line. She contacted my doctor, claimed I was confused, suggested evaluations, implied vulnerability. The trustee informed me immediately. I didn't panic. I laughed. That single move told me everything I needed to know. They weren't worried about me. They were afraid of losing access. And fear makes people reckless. I sent one email. Short, precise. To whom it may concern, any attempt to question my mental capacity will be considered harassment and handled accordingly. Further contact should be directed to my legal representative. No signature, no emotion. The response was silence. For now, as I watched the sun sink into the ocean that evening, I understood something deeply unsettling and empowering. They had spent years rehearsing my disappearance. They never imagined my return would look like this. I didn't announce my return to England. I let it surface naturally, the way truth always does when people are too busy lying to notice the crux. A photo appeared on a distant cousin's page, me, smiling politely at a charity luncheon in Nassau weeks earlier. Nothing dramatic. Just proof that I was upright, aware, and very much present. Within hours, my phone lit up like a confession booth. Rachel called first. I didn't answer. Thomas followed with a text that tried to sound respectful and failed. Then came the relatives, the ones who had been quiet when the card was read aloud, the ones who laughed along or said nothing at all. Concern suddenly bloomed where indifference had lived comfortably. Concern is convenient. Back in Birmingham, rumors had begun to outpace facts. Rachel had told people I was resting and unwell, but my absence had stretched too long to sell that story anymore. The money hadn't resumed. The trustee hadn't budged. And now there was evidence that contradicted the narrative she had crafted so carefully. I returned on a gray morning, slipping into my apartment without ceremony. No balloons. No welcomes. Just the familiar hum of a place that had waited for me without judgment. I slept deeply that night, the kind of sleep you earn when you stop fighting reality. The next afternoon, Rachel showed up again. She didn't knock. She rang the bell 3 times in quick succession, urgency replacing entitlement. When I opened the door, her face shifted relief first, then calculation. "You should have told me you were back," she said. "I don't need permission," I replied. She stepped inside, scanning the room as if checking for signs of decline. Her eyes paused on the neat stack of mail, the fresh flowers on the table, the clarity of this face. Nothing to report, nothing to weaponize. "People are worried," she said, lowering her voice. "This has gone too far." "Has it?" I asked. She sat, clasped her hands, and tried a different angle. Softer. Familiar. "Mom, we just want what's best for you." I met her gaze steadily. "You want access." Her jaw tightened. The truth has a way of cutting negotiations short. "What about the children?" she pressed. "Ethan and Lily don't understand why you've pulled away." "I haven't pulled away," I said. "I've stepped back." She stood abruptly, pacing. "You're punishing us." "No," I replied calmly. "I'm protecting myself." That was when she said it, the sentence that told me everything had shifted. "If you don't fix this," she said, "we'll have to explore other options." Other options. Legal options. Medical options. The kind people use when control slips through their fingers. I nodded slowly. "You're free to explore," I said. "Just know I'm already there." She stared at me, finally understanding she was behind. Not emotionally, strategically. The following week, Thomas made his move. He contacted a solicitor, claiming concern over my mental fitness and suggesting a review. He underestimated how thoroughly I had prepared. The letter was met with immediate response from my legal team, firm, documented, and unyielding. The attempt backfired. Quietly, but decisively. Word spread, not as gossip as fact. That I had legal representation. That I had anticipated this. That any further pressure would invite scrutiny they could not afford. Suddenly, invitations stopped. Calls slowed. People don't like proximity to consequences. Rachel didn't call for days after that. Then, one evening, a message arrived. Not angry. Not manipulative. Just tired. "I don't recognize you anymore," she wrote. I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing my reply. "That's because you never knew me. I didn't send anything else." What surprised me most wasn't their fear, it was how quickly it exposed the truth. The love they claimed had always been conditional, dependent on usefulness, on access, on silence. Without those, there was nothing left to stand on. I began attending events again, not to be seen, but to be known. I spoke when invited. I listened more than I talked. People responded differently now, with curiosity, with respect. The story had shifted, and Rachel could no longer control it. One afternoon, I received an envelope in the mail. Inside was the original Mother's Day card. No note, no apology, just the card. I held it for a long time, then placed it back into the envelope and filed it away with my documents. Not as a wound, as evidence. Because the final phase wasn't about confrontation. It was about closure on my terms. And they were finally starting to understand that this wasn't a phase, or a misunderstanding, or a temporary silence. This was permanence. The meeting invitation arrived without warning. A family gathering, they called it. Neutral ground. Mediated conversation. Words meant to sound mature when desperation is wearing a polite coat. I read the message twice, then once more slowly. No apology. No accountability. Just an assumption that I would come when summoned. I didn't respond immediately. Silence, I had learned, forces people to reveal their intentions more clearly than words ever could. 2 days later, another message followed. Shorter, sharper, less confident. A cousin had been asked to help smooth things over. The circle was closing in, not around me, around them. I agreed to attend. Not because I owed them anything, but because I wanted witnesses. The gathering took place in a modest restaurant just outside the city. Neutral enough. Public enough. I arrived alone, dressed simply, carrying nothing but my composure. When I walked in, conversations paused. Not out of reverence, out of uncertainty. People don't know how to act when the narrative they rehearse starts contradicting reality. Rachel sat at the far end of the table, jaw tight, eyes alert. Thomas beside her, unusually quiet. Around them, faces that had once smiled too easily now watched carefully, measuring. We exchanged greetings. Polite. Controlled. No warmth. The cousin cleared his throat and spoke first, talking about family bonds and misunderstandings and how age can complicate things. I listened without interrupting. Let him finish. Let the words exhaust themselves. Then I spoke. I'd like to clarify something, I said calmly. I am not confused. I am not unwell. And I am not being managed. The table stilled. I have legal representation. I have independent medical evaluations. And I have full capacity. I paused, letting that land. Any suggestion otherwise has been documented. Rachel's face drained of color. Thomas shifted. Someone across the table set their glass down a little too hard. I also want to address the Mother's Day card, I continued. My voice didn't shake. It was not a joke. It was cruelty disguised as humor, delivered publicly. A few people looked away. I kept quiet for years, I said. Not because I didn't notice, but because I believed silence was love. It isn't. Rachel tried to interrupt. Mom, I raised my hand gently. She stopped. I'm not here to be understood, I said. I'm here to be clear. Then I stood. I will not be attending further gatherings that question my worth. I will not be funding lives that belittle mine. And I will not be manipulated through guilt, grandchildren, or fear. No shouting. No accusations. Just boundaries spoken out loud. When I left, no one followed. That evening, my phone stayed quiet until one message arrived. From Rachel. You embarrassed us. I read it once. Then I blocked her. Not out of anger. Out of finality. The next morning, a distant relative called to apologize. Not with excuses, with humility. Others followed over the next few days. Quiet acknowledgments. Regret, delayed but sincere. The truth had shifted rooms. People now understood what had happened, not because I pleaded, but because I refused to perform weakness anymore. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to, because power, I had learned, doesn't announce itself. It settles. The card was still filed away. The trust was still sealed. The boundaries were intact. And for the first time since motherhood had defined my existence, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. What came next wasn't revenge in the way people imagine it. It was something far more unsettling for those who had underestimated me. It was independence. And it scared them more than anger ever could. I thought blocking Rachel would bring noise, anger, escalation, chaos. Instead, it brought something far more revealing. Nothing. For weeks, there was no message, no apology, no attempt to bridge what had been broken. Silence, when it comes from people who once demanded access, is not peace. It's strategy. I knew that. I waited without anxiety, the way you wait when you already know the ending. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Official. Polite. Dangerous. A solicitor, acting on behalf of Rachel and Thomas, requested a voluntary family mediation to discuss my long-term care needs. The wording was careful. No accusations. No conclusions. Just enough implication to reopen a door they hoped I'd panic and run through. I didn't. I forwarded it to my legal team and went for a walk. When I returned, there was already a response drafted, firm, factual, unemotional. It included medical evaluations, legal documentation, and a warning against further attempts to challenge my autonomy. It also included something new, a counter notice. Any continued interference would trigger a formal review of financial interactions over the last 15 years. That was the move they never expected. Because history is only harmless when no one checks the receipts. 3 days later, Thomas called from a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring. He left a voicemail, his voice tense, controlled, rehearsed. We just want to resolve this quietly. Quietly. That word again. Quietly is what they asked for when I paid bills without question. Quietly is how they accepted help without gratitude. Quietly is how they laughed while humiliating me in public. I deleted the message. The following week, a mutual acquaintance reached out, someone who didn't usually get involved. Her tone was cautious. There's a lot of stress on them right now, she said. They're worried things could get complicated. Complicated for who, I wondered. Because my life, finally, was simple. I spent my mornings reading, my afternoons volunteering twice a week, not as a savior, but as a participant. Evenings were quiet, intentional. I cooked what I liked, slept when I was tired, spoke only when I meant it. One afternoon, while organizing old files, I found photographs I hadn't seen in years. Me in my 40s, smiling without apology. Me before motherhood became self-erasure. I realized something that startled me. They weren't trying to take my future. They were trying to reclaim the version of me they could control. That version was gone. News travels quickly when fear replaces confidence. Thomas's job situation shifted. Rachel stopped attending certain events. Invitations dried up. People don't abandon others because they're cruel. They do it because risk has entered the room. And risk now followed them. I received one final message from Rachel. Not angry. Not threatening. Small. I don't understand why you're doing this. I stared at the words for a long time. Then I typed my response. I'm not doing anything to you. I'm doing something for myself. I sent it. That was the last time we spoke. I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. Because revenge isn't about destruction. It's about reclaiming authorship. About refusing to let people who diminished you narrate your ending. As I closed my laptop that night, I understood the truth they would carry long after I stopped caring. They didn't lose me because I was old. They lost me because I finally stopped asking to belong. For most of my life, I survived by being invisible when it suited others. Quiet. Agreeable. Grateful for scraps of attention. I told myself it was maturity. That silence was dignity. But what it really was training. I had trained myself to shrink so others could stand taller. That ended the morning I stepped outside without looking over my shoulder. It was early. The city was still waking up, the air cool and clean, the kind of morning that feels like a promise. I wrapped my coat tighter around me and walked to the cafe 2 blocks away, the one I had avoided for years because Rachel used to take the children there. I had told myself it was easier not to go, easier not to remember. That day, I chose difficult. The barista smiled and asked my name for the cup. I almost gave the old answer, the shortened, softened version I used when I didn't want questions. Instead, I said it clearly. My name is Marianne. She wrote it carefully. No hesitation. No judgment. Just ink on paper. Recognition without conditions. I sat by the window, sipping my coffee slowly, watching people pass. Young couples. Tired parents. Elderly women walking alone like me. I realized something that made my chest ache in a good way. No one was watching me fail. No one was waiting for me to apologize for existing. Later that afternoon, I received an email from the community center where I volunteered twice a week. They were hosting a small panel discussion about aging with dignity. They asked if I would be willing to speak, just a few minutes, about independence later in life. The old me would have declined. The old me would have said, I'm not the right person. I accepted. The night before the event, I barely slept. Not from fear, from clarity. Memories surfaced uninvited. The times I had swallowed words. The times I had paid for silence with money, with energy, with pieces of myself I would never get back. I didn't rehearse a speech. I didn't need to. The truth, once you stop hiding it, speaks for itself. The room was small but full. Faces turned toward me, curious, respectful, present. I stood at the podium, hands steady, heart open. I spent decades believing love meant endurance, I began. That if I gave enough, stayed quiet enough, needed little enough, I would be allowed to belong. A pause. Breathing. I was wrong. I spoke about boundaries. About late life awakening. About how generosity without respect becomes exploitation. I didn't name Rachel. I didn't mention Thomas. I didn't need to. People understand pain even when you don't give them names. Afterward, a woman approached me, younger than me by decades, eyes bright with unshed tears. My mother is living what you described, she whispered. I didn't know how to help her. I took her hand. Tell her she's allowed to choose herself, I said. Even now. Especially now. That night, I walked home lighter. A week later, something unexpected happened. An article appeared online, a short piece about the event. A photo of me standing at the podium. My name spelled correctly. My age mentioned not as a weakness, but as context. Someone shared it. Then someone else did. I didn't seek attention. I didn't deny it either. By the third day, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Rachel. I didn't answer. Not because I was afraid, but because I was done explaining myself to people who only listen when they're losing control. That evening, I stood in front of my mirror and studied my reflection, the lines, the silver hair, the eyes that had finally stopped asking for permission. I wasn't invisible anymore. And that, more than any legal victory or financial boundary, was the moment I truly became untouchable. The weeks that followed my speech at the community hall were quiet, yet profoundly alive. I woke each morning without dread, without waiting for calls or messages that never came. My apartment smelled of fresh flowers and coffee, not tension or anticipation. I no longer measured myself by the expectations of others. I measured myself by the life I wanted to live. The Nassau property became more than an inheritance. It became my sanctuary, my proof that years of careful planning and quiet generosity weren't mistakes. The first flight I booked there was luxurious, first class, but it wasn't about showing off. It was about honoring myself in a way that I hadn't dared to for decades. Every moment on board was mine alone, no whispers, no judgments, no obligations. Just the hum of the engines, the sunlight on my hands, and the clarity of purpose I had fought to reclaim. When I arrived, the ocean stretched endlessly, blue and relentless, like freedom itself. The condo, perched above the white sand beaches, felt like an old friend greeting me after a long absence. I wandered through each room, letting my fingers trace the counters and shelves. This space had always existed, quietly accumulating value while I played the part of someone with nothing. Now it was mine in every sense. I spent that first evening walking along the shoreline, the waves lapping gently at my feet. I thought of Rachel, of Thomas, of the card, the laughter, the manipulation. They had tried to reduce me to a shadow of myself, but shadows only exist when there is light to define them. I was defined now, brightly, firmly, without apology. The phone remained silent. I didn't block anyone new. I simply didn't answer. They could attempt to reach me, but I no longer had to be available. Their assumptions about control, about fear, about obligation meant nothing in this chapter of my life. I was the author, the editor, and the proofreader. For the first time in years, I allowed myself pleasure without guilt. Mornings were for reading on the balcony, afternoons for walks in the nearby gardens, and evenings for journaling or hosting small gatherings of friends I had chosen for warmth and intellect, not obligation. Laughter filled my spaces again, real, unforced, untethered. And yet, the greatest satisfaction was quiet, internal, unmeasurable. It wasn't about proving anything to them. It was about proving everything to myself. Every sacrifice, every heartbreak, every moment of doubt had led me here, standing fully, without fear, without shame, entirely my own. I thought of my past, of the Mother's Day card, of the countless times I had given and been disregarded. Those moments no longer carried power over me. They were lessons, not anchors. And in that realization, I found peace that no apology, no recognition, and no family intervention could provide. The last message arrived months later. A simple, muted note from a relative who had once been neutral, even complicit in the laughter. We see now. I hope you're happy. I didn't reply, because happiness, I finally understood, isn't something granted by others. It is claimed fiercely and deliberately in moments when you refuse to let anyone diminish your worth. I had claimed mine. Marianne, the woman who had once waited for acknowledgement, who had once been silenced, humiliated, and underestimated, had returned fully. Not as a figure of vengeance, not as a shadow of fear, but as a living testament. Boundaries are strength, autonomy is power, and self-respect is the last luxury no one can take away. I stood on my balcony, looking at the waves that mirrored the sky's endless expanse, and smiled. The past was mine to remember, but the future, radiant, vast, and mine entirely, waited to be lived. And that was enough. If you felt Marian's journey from heartbreak, betrayal, and humiliation to self-discovery, empowerment, and freedom, leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever had a moment where you realized your worth and stood up for yourself? I would love to read your story. Also, if you want to follow more stories like this, filled with suspense, emotion, and life-changing lessons, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that inspires and empowers. And don't forget to share this story with someone who needs to be reminded of their value. Sometimes the right story at the right time can change a life.